Welcome, everyone, to Staking Your Claim, How Boundaries Can Set You Free in Work and Life. My name is Amanda Raymond, and I serve as the Associate Director of Alumni Career Engagement. And on behalf of UCLA Alumni Affairs, we welcome you to today's event. The Career Coaches Network series is made possible by the support of our sustaining donors. So we want to thank those of you who've made a donation to our programs that go throughout the year. Your UCLA Alumni Association is committed to strengthening the Bruin community with programs like this. For some housekeeping, if you have any questions for our speaker today, please use the Q&A feature instead of the chat, and please do submit your questions. Also, we will be recording today's session, so if you need to review it, you will have access to it in the future. Today's career coach, Jim Yort, will teach us all about setting healthy boundaries. Jim is an executive and career coach who specializes in helping professionals navigate vocational change with the confidence born of innate wisdom coupled with proven science. With that being said, I will turn it over to Jim. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Amanda. Hi, Joseph. Thank you for having me, and great to be here with all of you. It's one of my favorite things, spending time with all of you. You're my kind of people, because not only are you Bruins and Bruin aficionados, but you're people who are willing to carve out an hour of their busy life, take their lunch hour to invest in learning some really important concepts in personal development. And so you're my kind of people, and I'm going to do my best to make this an hour well spent for you. Okay, we got a lot to get to today, so let me share my screen and get started. Okay. So first of all, who's this for? So if you're ever feeling out of balance with work, like you're working too much, or whether at work or in any other part of your life, you feel like you're always putting yourself last, that your needs come after other people's, or you're feeling pessimistic about your future, or frustrated or deflated about the results of the efforts that you're making to feel happier, or have a better adjustment to your life circumstances. Or if no matter what you do, you feel like you can never do enough, or maybe even be enough. Well, what I'm going to submit for your consideration today is that these are all symptoms of boundaries that don't fit you quite right. So that, of course, raises a very important question of what is a boundary? So, when I was a kid, we had this rule at home that we wouldn't take calls after dinner time. And so that was a boundary that we set as a family, or my parents set, I should say. So it was setting a limit, if you will. Well, today I'd like to expand the way that we are thinking about and talking about boundaries, so that it's more than just limit setting. But what I invite you to do is consider a boundary to be the membrane where you end and the rest of the world begins, okay? That this is the interface between you and the world. And so therefore your boundary colors your experience of your relationship to the world, and it sort of defines or describes your place in the world. So in other words, we're talking about your identity, really. So the premise of our talk today is that for a variety of reasons, you might have gotten boxed in by forces outside of you that perhaps started acting upon you from your earliest moments of life, and took on some inertia, gained some momentum of their own. And at the same time, that it's also possible to reclaim, or maybe even claim for the first time, what your natural shape is. And that doing so doesn't necessarily require coming at the cost of other people's satisfaction. And in fact, it's not a zero-sum game at all, that everyone wins when you are able to reclaim your natural shape. So I can sort of illustrate with my arms here. What we're talking about is a boundary being this space that you're at the center of. And everyone has these. Everyone that you interact with in your life has their own universe, if you will, that they're at the center of. And we're bumping into each other. And there's some flexibility to these membranes, these boundaries. And sometimes we take a little bit more, sometimes we give up a little bit more. And there's some flexibility here. And same with everyone else's boundary. And hopefully somewhere in this range of mutual flexibility, there's a place that this membrane can fall where both parties feel good and comfortable and healthy. But what often happens, for reasons that we'll talk about today, is that our boundary starts to shrink like this. Okay, gets smaller and smaller until, worst case scenario, we can be left in a situation where we're sort of gasping for breath in this little space that's left over. Or perhaps more to the point, feeling like we've got to cram ourselves into life circumstances that just don't fit right. And it's a source of distress. And so what we're going to be talking about today then is how to fully expand and claim what's rightfully yours, just like other people are doing, okay? So that you can feel comfortable claiming your you-centric universe. And when this motion starts to happen, we start to give up more than we should, that we're able to plant a flag and say, no, here's the hard stop. Here's what I need and want to be healthy and happy, okay? And working from there out. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Go back to sharing the screen. So we're going to go beyond just how to set boundaries you can live with. Okay, you're already doing that. You're alive. Okay, here you are with the boundaries that you have. We're going to talk about the boundaries that you can thrive with, which are probably very different, okay? And how these can sort themselves out if you place your primary focus on your own thriving and then let your boundaries fall naturally from that starting point. So in other words, this is an inside job that we're setting ourselves free from the inside out using our boundaries. So just briefly, Amanda did a great job of introducing me. I'll just say I'm Jim Yort. That's how you pronounce that name. And Amanda is like one of the rare people who actually gets it right. And I'm an executive and career coach. And, more to the point, I'm a personal development coach, is how I really think of myself most of the time. Other times I'm a psychotherapist, licensed clinical social worker. I'm a mindfulness meditation teacher. I practice hypnosis. And in general, what I do is I sift through the latest developments in psychology, neurobiology, sociology, social psychology, other life and social sciences, and I try to distill those findings into action steps for people so that you don't have to go through all that trouble and consumption of research. So I went to grad school at a school on the other side of town, which we don't really talk about here. But I was able to actually find a file photo of what I looked like attending school on that campus. Looked something like that. And that's because I am a diehard Bruin, very happy Bruin. And therefore I'm really happy to be doing this work with the Alumni Association. So let's go back to what a boundary is, okay? So let's say here's you, and here's some of the other people in your life, okay? Maybe the first one there was your partner. Second is your community or your country or your city. Maybe you have a couple of kids, maybe you've got work, maybe you even have a dog, okay? So each of these circles, including your own, are systems. I'd like you to think of yourself as a system and every other bubble, if you will, that you interact with as its own system, okay? And these are where those membranes meet. So let's look at one in particular. You've got you and your work, okay? Now, you can probably think offhand of 50 of these systems easily that you encounter. And there are more meetings of boundaries than even that, because with respect to work, when you're at work, you're actually part of that system too, right? as an employee, you become part of that system. And then within that system of work, it breaks down even further. So maybe you've got a boundary with your boss and one with your colleagues, okay? And same thing with your family. Let's say you've got a partner, a couple kids, and a dog, right? Well, so there's you interacting independently with each of these other systems, but then your family is its own system, okay? Each of you comprising its own constituent parts, okay? And from the standpoint of those kids or that dog, you and your partner, say, actually are kind of a parental unit. You know, you're your own subsystem, okay? So I don't want to get lost in the weeds here. The point being is that you both interact with and are part of essentially an infinite number of systems. And there's one, only one, that is unlike all of the others. It's one that is a sovereign system. Okay, there's a sovereign boundary, and you are the sovereign. Okay, you're like the monarch, the king or queen. This one boundary, this one system, this one universe is the only one that you have complete autonomy within. It's the only one that you have direct unilateral control over. Okay, so if you've got this infinite universe of boundaries and one is special, one is different than all the others, then rationally, maybe that's the one that should be given special treatment, okay? And it's you, this one. Which then takes us to this concept of getting comfy with being selfish, okay? And that's a controversial word because it's got some negative connotations. It has negative connotations because we tend to think of selfishness as I'm going to get my needs met first and then to heck with everyone else, okay? And I call that anti-social selfishness. And we could probably all agree that we've got enough of that already. We don't need any more. So that's not what we're going for. It's not what I'm suggesting in this talk. What I'm talking about is something I call prosocial selfishness. Okay, this is, yeah, I'm going to get my needs met first, yes, so that I can show up in all those meetings of membranes, all those interfaces as a whole and healthy person, as a partner, as an employee, as a son or daughter, whatever, right? In all those infinite other places, I'm going to show up my very best and healthiest because I'm focusing first on me. Kind of like when you fly, you know, they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first before your kids. Some parents have a kind of reaction to that. You know, they think, well, no, of course I'm going to put it on the kids first, but there's a reason why they tell you that, right? If you pass out, then your kids don't have anyone to look out for them. So talking about putting your own mask on first, your own oxygen mask, okay? So that you can show up healthy everywhere and everyone wins that way. That's why it's not a zero-sum game as we often tend to think it is. So let's talk about how all this goes wrong, okay? And we become a doormat in one way or the other. So here are some signs or symptoms of being a doormat. This is not an all-inclusive list, but they include things like maybe feeling guilty or ashamed or regretful, or flip-flopping between extremes. You know, maybe, you know, the example that comes to mind is maybe binging on food and, you know, living an unhealthy lifestyle, a kind of sedentary lifestyle, and then becoming, you know, super focused on fitness and losing a lot of weight and kind of flip-flopping between those extremes. Okay. We can see that show up in all kinds of different areas of life. That sort of dynamic. Or if you're feeling pessimistic about the future, frustrated about, as I said before, sort of the impact or the results of the efforts that you're making, or if you find yourself as a workaholic, okay, these are all signs that you might be, we're calling today anyway, a doormat, okay, signs of a boundary problem. So let's talk about why. So this is in some ways your original system. This is your family of origin. Okay. And maybe it started out looking like this. You know, you've got a couple of parents, maybe a couple of siblings, maybe a grandparent. Everyone's family of origin, of course, looks different. But something to note about systems is that you notice that I'm depicting them all as circles, and there's a reason for that. You know, a system never has any overlap, and it never has any empty space, and it always seeks equilibrium, you know, kind of like a bubble. You know, bubbles never form in the shape of a square or a cube. They form as spheres, and that's what systems do. And so there's never any empty space, with one exception. And that exception is when you come along. Okay, when you come along, everyone scoots over a little bit. They adjust their boundaries. They create some space into which you get poured. You know, you could think of this as we sort of enter the world like Jello, you know, like liquid Jello. They create a space for you, a mold, if you will, and we get poured in to this mold and assume that shape. And this is really critical because of the way our brains are wired as human beings. So, you know, a lot of animals, if you watch wildlife shows, a lot of animals pretty soon after they're born are actually pretty functional, you know, like a baby deer, for instance. You know, they still will kind of hang out next to their mother deer. But if you watch these videos, you know, they, you know, pretty shortly after birth can kind of wobble around and eat grass and, you know, kind of try to run away if they need to. A lot of animals are like this. We're not. Okay, we enter this world as completely defenseless jelly beans, essentially. You know, we don't even have the understanding that we are a separate entity in the universe. In fact, there's a name for that. We call it symbiosis. Okay, an infant comes into the world, and when it meets eyes with its caregivers, it can't even tell the difference between the caregiver it's looking at and itself. Okay, so very rudimentary functioning. But we are hardwired with some very important information to make up for that, which is that we know that all of these other individuals, these big people that we can see around us, we know intuitively that we can't survive on our own, and that they are our surrogates, that they will keep us alive if and only if we're indispensable to them, that we fit into this system, okay? That we assume this shape that they've made for us. We intuitively know that if we don't, it's like Survivor, you know, you're voted off the island. And then being defenseless, you're a goner, okay? So we are wired, absolutely wired, to get comfortable in whatever shape we're poured into, okay? And since we started out without any awareness that we were a separate individual, we sort of grow, you know, thinking that's our natural shape. We've never known anything different, right? And then at some point we get older and leave our families of origin. And we don't necessarily have to physically leave, but at some point in our development, we begin to take on a more independent identity and start moving around the world. And whether it's conscious or not, usually it's not, we start looking around for holes the same shape as what we were poured into. Okay, maybe they poured us into a star shape, you know, maybe a different family, right? They pour you into a star shape, you start looking around for star-shaped holes to pop into. And when you do, there's something sort of soothing and familiar about that. Oh, this feels like a perfectly tailored suit, you know, this role that I have relative to these other people feels just right. But there's this other part of us that exists and craves development all of its own accord, that chances are is not that shape at all. It's a circle, okay? It's a sphere. It's its own, you have your own innate potential. and identity that's sort of begging for expression and development. And as that begins to happen, you start bumping up against these walls. And it's at that point that people start to get the sense that, oh no, this isn't a perfectly tailored suit at all. This is a straitjacket. And then they start to struggle, and you could think of this as really the origin of a lot of people's anxiety and depression, this sort of existential discovery of, oh, wait a minute, I'm not who I thought I was all this time. There's a part of me inside yearning to expand that's being constrained. Okay. So that shape that we were poured into, I'm calling that today your conditioned self. And this other part, okay, that's what I call your core self. So if you view this problem then through this framework, then you can start to maybe make some educated guesses about some of those symptoms, those doormat symptoms that we talked about. So that guilt or shame or regret could be the result of this internal disagreement about the course of action that you're choosing. What I see in working with people is it's often either your core self objecting to something you're doing that's contrary to your healthy long-term self-expression, or it's your conditioned self objecting to something that you're trying to do that's good for you in the long run, but doesn't fit that conditioned shape. Okay. So for instance, I run into this a lot with people. It's surprisingly common that people subordinate their own needs to other people's needs. And if you're poured into a shape in which, in some cases, let's say a person's born as the oldest child. And so they, as additional members of the family come along, younger siblings, they take on this role and they're poured into a shape and backed into a shape of being a caregiver, say, right, for their younger siblings. They're conditioned that, okay, if I want to stay on the island, if I want the protection of the tribe, the community, I've got to put myself second and put other people first. Okay. So that's one way this can play out. The flip-flopping between extremes. Often it's because you're trying to do something that you should do, okay, that your conditioned self thinks it should do, when your core self has a different plan for you, okay, has a different inclination. That pessimism, often because you can't see beyond the walls of the conditioned self that you are stuck in, okay? It's like, God, it seems so impossible. You hear the words, I can't, a lot, I can't do it. I've tried, doesn't ever seem to work. I can't make the changes I want. And so these walls that are really, they were never yours to begin with, okay? They were boundaries that were given to you, and you take them on over time as your own. And it's hard to see beyond them, that there could be other possibilities for yourself. And, feelings of frustration can often be the stifling of the abilities and frustration of the needs that core self of yours has. The workaholism symptom, I see that often shaking out in a couple of ways. One is the use of work almost as like a substance, to help distract from some of that anxiety and depression that we get when we sort of come into that realization that I'm stuck in a life that doesn't fit. So we can distract ourselves, throw ourselves into a healthy way of coping, healthier than others anyway, of working hard. Another way I see this playing out is, again, going back to the family of origin. If you came into the world with family dynamics that made your place in that system contingent upon production or performance or achievement, okay, that was part of the shape that you were poured into, then naturally you carry that with you out into the world and feel like, well, if I don't do that, then people won't like me, or I don't know who I am, if I don't achieve all the time. Okay, so in this talk today, what I wanted to do is give you this kind of broad theoretical framework, which I like to do. I don't, they talk about teaching a person to fish versus giving them a fish. I like to do both, okay? I want to give you the framework to understand how and why some of these feelings and dynamics arise. And now let's talk about how to, here's some fish I'm going to give you. What are some practical tools we can use to start developing boundaries that are a better fit for our core self? So, negotiating boundaries. If we go back to the little demonstration I did with my arms, you could think of our boundaries as being like a bubble, like I was saying, a bubble that needs constant air pressure to keep it inflated. And so that positive air pressure comes in the way of expressing ourselves, expressing our needs and desires, sometimes in opposition to the pressure that the other person's bubble is exerting on us, okay? We're going to talk about shifting from reacting to responding, okay? And stacking the odds in your favor of being heard and understood by the other person and having your needs met. And since you responded in a wise way, in a way that was consistent with your long-term well-being, the other person can deal with the regret of their behaviors. You won't have anything to regret on your side, okay? So I'm going to give you 3 communication tools here. And I can virtually guarantee that if you practice these 3 tools, they will produce positive changes in any relationship in which you employ them. They're sort of like ninja communication skills if you practice them and master them. So here they are. And by the way, at the end of this talk, I'm going to give you an opportunity to get a copy of these slides. You can sign up for my email list, and then you can get a download of these slides. So feel free to not take notes, okay? And just pay attention, and you can get the slides later. So the first tool is something called the I statement. This is really the basic unit of healthy communication and communication of your needs in a healthy way, okay? When you blank, I feel blank, period. That's it. Okay. Here are some words that should never go in the I statement, even though I just said the word should. These should never go in the I statement. Always, never, makes me, as in you make me feel X, Y, or Z, or should. Okay, why are we carving these words out? Well, let's see. No one always or never does anything. And we all kind of intuitively know that, okay? So if you use one of these words in your I statement, the other person, whether they realize it or not, they detect that an attack is incoming, okay? And they'll shut down, stop listening to what you're saying, and start formulating a defense, okay? So if you use these words, usually you've lost the person before you even finish the sentence, okay? So take those out. We're taking out makes me because technically no one's making you feel anything, regardless of what's happening with the boundary, okay? The other person is doing or saying something, and then an emotion is arising within you. There's a cause and effect relationship. And that's all the I statement's trying to do. It's trying to make very clear this objective causal relationship between the other person's actions and your feelings, okay? Should, we're taking that out for the same reason really as always or never. It's got this kind of finger wagging, judgmental tone to it that turns people off, and they'll start coming up with a defense. Okay, so what we're doing with the I statement then is just stripping down our communication to the objective fact and taking out any spin. Spin is where other people can dig in and fight you, okay? We just want the objective truth. that's much more likely to get in and be heard by the other person. Okay, so it's stacking the odds in your favor, but not in a manipulative way, in a healthy way. Okay, you're communicating directly and clearly and owning your own feelings. Okay, so the I statement. The healthy ask is then what you would follow the I statement up with. I'd feel better if you would blank. Would you be willing to do that for me? Question mark. Okay. So in the first step with the I statement, you've put the person on notice that, hey, you know, when you do this thing, this unpleasant feeling arises within me. Now, if the person cares about you, now, you know, this might not work as well with a perfect stranger, okay? But if they care about you to some degree, then okay, you aren't attacking them, you aren't spinning, you're just letting them know, hey, like when you do this, this hurts, okay? Okay, now you're following that up with essentially a blueprint. You know, if you're interested in that not happening, here's something you could try. Would you be willing to try that for me? You hear how that sounds? Okay, so it's not a tug of war. You're inviting the person in to work with you on this boundary where the membrane falls. Okay, so it's not force on force. You're inviting them into a sort of organic process of negotiating. Now, I know that sounds really nice and easy and lovely, but we all know that not everyone is going to respond in that way. Okay, sometimes people, no matter what approach you take, they're going to argue and fight back. And you know, people who aren't on this talk might not be aware that there's a different way to communicate. People tend to get into communication patterns and habits, and they become the path of least resistance. And we're always going to default to the path of least resistance. Okay, so if you try the I statement and the healthy ask, and you get sort of blowback, here's what I suggest you do. Put your ask aside for a second and start using reflective listening. Okay, words kind of to this effect. Okay, if I understand you correctly, when I blank, you feel blank. Is that about right? You know, or words to that effect. Okay. If I understand you correctly, when I blank, you feel blank. Is that about right? Oh, okay. So again, rather than meeting force with force, what you're going to do is, you know, when people are talking to you like this, especially if they're really heated, it's kind of like they're throwing fastballs at you, you know. And if you're having actual fastballs thrown at you, you don't just hold your hand up and kind of let them bonk off, right? You move with them to catch, move with them like this. Each time you reflect, you're catching a fastball, you're allowing the other person to discharge this energy, this animosity, okay? And you're down regulating them. Why? Because they're feeling heard. Especially if you're in a conflictual sort of communication, there's nothing that a person wants more than to feel heard and understood. A good customer service rep will do this with you too. Okay. Oh yeah, it sounds really difficult what you're dealing with there, ma'am. Right? Let me see what I can do to help you. Ah, okay, right. That's what we want to hear. So when in doubt, reflect. You're helping the other person feel heard and understood. And it so happens psychologically, as you do that, each time you reflect and help them feel heard, it's like a gift. And you do that a few times, and all of a sudden, psychologically, they begin to feel indebted to you. Okay. They're more likely now, when you bring your I statement and healthy ask back in, they're more likely to be receptive to it and hear you. Okay. Because you've done the same for them now. So again, this is not an effort to be manipulative, right? This is a way to be very healthy and clear in your communication and stack the odds in your favor of being heard and getting your needs met, right? But in a very healthy way. Practice these three. Oh, and by the way, I should say, I'm talking about all of these in sort of a negative framework, but the I statement can also be used to highlight things that someone does that cause a positive feeling to arise within you. And as effective as the I statement is in those negative situations, oh man, people love to hear that something they did caused a positive feeling to come up at someone. People love that. Okay, it's like candy. So tell someone that, geez, when you treated me this way, I felt really cared for or respected. Thank you. Boy, tell someone that and watch what happens. Okay. I encourage you to treat all of these like experiments. Okay. Go out into the world and experiment with this stuff and just see for yourself what happens. Don't take my word for it. Okay. So that is how you would then communicate with other people where the membranes meet. But the sort of step before that is, what is it that I need to express? What is the nature of my core self? Okay, so that natural expansion, knowing how and what it is, how you want to expand and what it is you're trying to achieve, that's going to relieve that internal pressure that you feel bumping up against the conditioned self. Okay, it's a matter of knowing yourself and building your universe out, your self-centric universe, by feel. Okay, what I mean by that is that it's less about how you want your life to look and more about how you want your life to feel. If you prioritize the latter, the former will start to take care of itself. Okay, so here you are, and what I'd like to encourage you to do is to think about yourself not as a kind of a monolith, but as a being that exists in these 4 domains. Okay, these 4 kind of comprise your whole sovereign, core self system: the psychological domain, physical, social, and vocational domains. Okay, these are really the big 4 that our lives play out upon. And in this context, vocational is not limited to just paid work. It's any sort of active, productive engagement in the world. So that includes things like volunteer work, hobbies, things like that. Okay. So the DNA of your core self then is this aggregate of a few things: the values that you hold dear, okay, that really resonate with you; the qualities that you really feel gratified or enjoy manifesting in the world. Also, they're the qualities that you admire in other people, okay? Because those tend to be a kind of a direct reflection of the qualities that you'd like for yourself. And the feelings that you really enjoy feeling, okay? In each of those 4 domains. That's building out a life the way you want it to feel and not look, okay? So these are called intrinsic motivators. We could do a whole other talk just on this distinction, but it's intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic. Extrinsic motivators are things that are objective, observable, tangible. I could look at you and tell whether you have those things or not. Intrinsic motivators are intangible, subjective, eternal. They're known only to you. I might be able to look at you and guess whether you're experiencing this feeling or honoring this value, but it's the kind of thing that only one person in the world knows for sure whether you have. It's you. Okay, so this is your core self DNA. So I want to give you a couple questions here that you can ask yourself to start exploring some of this DNA, start to identify it. And then I'm going to give you a little trick, a little game you can play to start expanding your core self starting today, okay, as soon as we get off this call. So here's 2 questions I'd like to submit for your consideration. I'm going to give you several different scenarios. And in each one, ask yourself, what are the values I'm honoring? And what are the qualities I'm exhibiting in each of the following scenarios, okay? So at the times I'm happiest At the times I feel most whole. At the times I feel most alive. Okay, so I want to be clear. We're not looking for activities here. Like, what am I doing at the times when I'm happiest? No, we want the layer below that, okay? So let's say at the times I'm happiest, one of the ways is maybe when I'm volunteering, let's say, okay? Volunteering is extrinsic. I can watch you volunteer somewhere, right? The question would be, okay, at the times I'm happiest volunteering, what is it about that activity? What's the value or values that are kind of wrapped up in that I'm being true to when I'm doing that? What are the qualities of mine that are on display? Okay, that's what we're going for. By the way, the research on this distinction between the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, it's really fascinating. If there's one thing that is known to be true, basically beyond the shadow of a doubt, okay, it's about as theoretical as gravity is at this point. It's that people whose long-term motivations are extrinsic in nature, okay, focusing on how they want their lives to look, tend to be much less happy than people whose long-term motivations are intrinsic in nature. Okay, they've repeated this over and over the course of decades. We know it to be true, and yet we're conditioned in the exact opposite way in our society. So what we're doing here is we're going against the grain. Okay, I want you to really drop in and consider the intrinsic motivations behind the extrinsic things that you seem to gravitate towards. Okay, at the times I'm performing at my best. At the times I'm performing effortlessly, what I'm going for there are those times when you're in those flow states, you know, when you get so engrossed in something that you know, time just passes, it kind of falls away, time and space just disappear, and you're fully engrossed in that activity. In those moments, what are the values that you're honoring, the qualities you're exhibiting? What about at the times you make decisions that you subsequently are proud of making? Okay, so those 6 questions, well, I guess 12 questions. And then this one. What feelings would I like to experience more frequently by the end of the year? Okay, so this is something I encourage you to spend some time with. So not just dashing them off here on this call, but you know, later today, maybe tonight, create a bubble of time and space for yourself when you get home, say, and really set the tone for some high quality contemplative self-care time. You know, if for you that's lighting a candle and putting on some soft music, you know, whatever, lighting some incense, whatever it is for you, set the stage to really drop in and start connecting with this intrinsic aspect of yourself, and come up with some good answers to these questions. And then I'd like to introduce you to this little, so a recent development in my coaching work, the grab bag. So this is kind of fresh off the presses that I've been implementing with people lately. So it's a way to, without too much time investment, to really start putting these newfound realizations or newfound focuses into play in your daily life. Okay, so first, I want you to write each of your answers, each of those intrinsic values, qualities, or feelings on a slip of paper or a piece of cardstock or something. Put them into a bowl or a bag or something, your grab bag. And you're going to do 3 things. 1, first thing in the morning, pick a piece out of the bag. And that's going to be your theme for the day. Okay. And you're going to do 2 things with respect to that theme. 1, take some new action that you weren't otherwise going to do that day. So some deliberate action that manifests that quality or produces that feeling or honors that value. Okay. So a new behavior, new action that you wouldn't otherwise have done. And allow that word to be your theme for the day, meaning that I'd like you to recognize as often as you can the way that value, quality, or feeling is already being honored or manifested or experienced in your normal day-to-day life. Okay. Again, we're conditioned in a completely opposite way. You know, we turn on the TV and every commercial we see is trying to sell us on the idea that this extrinsic thing is what's connected to my happiness. And there's a reason for that, because your reptilian brain is looking for short-term gratification, and it's extremely powerful, and all the advertisers know that. Okay, so they're appealing, hey, to, you know, get white teeth, you'll be happy. You know, buy this thing, put this thing in your mouth, you'll be happy. And you probably know from your personal experience that's really not true. Okay, we end up hopping from one foot to the other, always in this state of actually kind of anxiety and distress, you know, waiting for the next short-term gratification to come along. None of it ever works. Okay. Your core self, what it's trying to expand into, is something very different. So some takeaways here, that some of the most powerful forces acting on you, I think of them as being like the wind. Okay. You can't see the wind. You can only see the effects of it, things being blown around by it, right? The wind, it was set into motion a long time ago on the other side of the ocean, maybe. And it moves around because of different, you know, pressure variations in the atmosphere. That's what's going on. Okay. We tend to identify with all of it as ourselves, but it's not. It's not. A lot of it is outside of ourselves, and we've made the mistake of thinking it's us. Okay. And so what's important about that then is that there's no part of you that's trying to keep you stuck or frustrated or sabotage you, you know, at work or in any other part of your life. Again, we could do a whole other talk just on this, but each of these parts, okay, have a neurobiological basis. There's a reptilian brain that we have that's trying to keep us safe and comfortable in the short term. That's the part that's connected to that conditioned self. Okay. This is all I've ever known. If I move outside these boundaries, I'm at risk, better stay safe. Okay. It doesn't realize that that strategy will ultimately just perpetuate long-term distress. Okay. It's trying to keep you safe and happy in the short term. Your core self wants you to be deeply gratified and at ease and energized with meaning and purpose in the long run. So there's not an enemy within. Actually, both parts have your best interests in mind. They're always negotiating how best for you to be happy. So what we're talking about then is not trying to get rid of some aspect of our psyche, but rather more consistently orienting to the intrinsic gratification in our life, letting our core self and its DNA be the given. Let that be the starting point, and let that inform where you make your stand, okay? Where you set your boundaries. And then the way your life looks will work itself out. It'll work itself out in a way that feels good, because that's what you've prioritized for yourself. So your boundaries are like the leading edge of this lifelong process of personal growth. Okay, so why don't we switch over to Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Great. We have a few questions. Thank you so much. This has been such a great session, and I feel like I've learned so much, and I have a lot of work and so many things to practice now. It's great. Thank you. On that note, we do have questions specifically regarding the healthy communication skill, specifically with a healthy ask. What if the other person that you're asking kind of blows off your healthy ask? You handle that.
Okay. So that happens for sure. Okay, so like I mentioned, because our default mode neurobiologically is to the reptilian brain, okay, that's the part that's concerned with one thing ultimately and one thing only, your survival. And the only way that it can operationalize that goal is if it feels good right now, it must be good for my survival. And if it feels bad right now, meaning that it requires effort, it requires facing change, you're doing any kind of work, then that must be bad for survival. Okay. It's a very simple but very powerful part of our brain. And so someone who's not made the commitment to do something like carve out their lunch hour to, attend a personal development, webinar, someone who's just content going with the flow is going to default to those habitual patterns of communication. Okay. Even now, the tools I gave you can definitely help break people out of that, but they aren't guaranteed. So if they reject your healthy ask, let me drop this in, that relationships are, in some ways, you can boil them down to being like a transaction. Okay. If you think about market value, the way market value is defined is that a fully informed buyer and a fully informed seller both have this meeting of the minds at which they agree that the value of something is what it is. Okay. So with your I statement and your healthy ask, you're causing the other person to be fully informed. You've made it clear without spin so that they can get it. Okay. That when you do this, this difficult thing happens with me. Could you try to do this maybe instead? Okay. That answer is either going to be yes, I'm willing and able to do that, or no. Okay. If it's no, then it goes back to you. Is this a deal breaker? Is this where I set my boundary or not? Okay. And, if they say no, you also have a new piece of information that maybe you didn't have before. Because if you're into this kind of bickering maybe pattern that you have with the person, you don't really have any new information. All you have is confirmation of that pattern. When you stop that and say, okay, hold on, time out. When you do this, this feeling arises, and they keep doing it. Now you've got a new piece of information with which you can make your decision.
Right, right. There's actually a number of questions coming in, so I'm trying to consolidate them. But what I'm seeing in terms of pattern, kind of building off this question, is how about in situations where there's a power differential, so a differentiation of like, your boss. So, maybe it's a partner or a friend, but it's the supervisor. Any advice there?
Well, okay. Like I said, I feel like we can't really go wrong if we always orient toward that core self, okay? And expressing our long-term intrinsic, healthy, growth-oriented needs in a healthy, objective, and kind of non-attacking way. Here's an anecdote. I don't know if this will quite get at the answer, okay? But years ago, before I did this kind of work, I was in a completely different line of work. Okay, I used to be in high finance, but I did this stuff sort of on the side, right? It was a hobby of mine. And I went in one day to interview for this great new opportunity. It was the ground floor of this like private equity fund, and it was like this huge opportunity. And lo and behold, they offered me the job, but at X pay. And so I went in to speak with the CEO, and I said, you know what? I am flattered at receiving this offer. And I'm going to tell you right now that however you answer what I say next, I'm going to accept the position. But I'd feel better accepting it if we could start my salary here instead. And he looked like I just like shot him between the eyes. He looks like he didn't know how to respond to that at first. But what I had done was give him the opportunity to be generous, to feel good about himself. Okay. Now, I'm not saying to do this in every situation, because there are plenty of people that say, well, too bad, right? It's the lower number and thanks for accepting the offer. Okay, that's going to happen. But in that situation, I sort of approached it from a position of authenticity and strength and of expressing my needs in a healthy way. And lo and behold, he took the opportunity to say, yeah, you know what, I want him to feel good and happy. So yeah, please, I'll do that. Right.
Okay, great.
Yep.
The next question.
By the way, I'm going to put up the final slide.
Oh, yes.
Because I promised the opportunity to download the slides. So if you go to this link here, I think we're going to drop it in the chat too. If you go to that link, it'll give you the opportunity to join my email list, and then it'll take you to a page where you can download the slides if you'd like.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
And we have so many questions, so I think a lot of people will be reaching out to you directly. And so please do, if we don't get to your question, I apologize. So I think we have time for one more. And so you mentioned this approach of the grab bag, and that sounds great. Mm-hmm. Definitely going to give it a try. But what happens if a situation comes up randomly and I'm torn about what to do in the moment? Any advice there?
Yeah, so the kind of quick and dirty answer to that goes back to what I was saying about the neurobiological basis for everything that we're talking about here. The reptilian brain that's looking for short-term gratification and avoidance of pain and discomfort and effort. And the cerebral cortex, and specifically the prefrontal cortex, the brain's CEO, that has this other vision, this felt vision of the life that it wants for you, okay? Long-term oriented and willing to do difficult things right now, like attending talks like this, okay? This is the harder of different options that you had, okay? It's willing to do stuff like this in exchange for the longer term benefit. Okay, those are the two parts that you're working with when you're feeling torn. So for that reason, if you consistently choose the option that is both seems to be in your long-term interest and feels like the harder of two options, that's probably the one that your core self is rooting for you to take, okay? Because the part of you that's judging it as difficult is your reptilian brain, i.e. your core self wants you to go the other direction. So when in doubt, choose the harder thing.
Great.
Yeah.
Jim, thank you so much. It's been such an amazing session, and there's just so much content here to take. And I really encourage you all in our audience to reach out to Jim. He's wonderful to work with. So thank you so much for being here with us. And please check out our link. We have an upcoming session. Our next session for the Career Coaches Network is Position Yourself for a Promotion. So that will be on May 17th at noon. So I want to thank our audience for being here and joining us at your lunch hour. As Jim was mentioning, thank you so much. And I hope this was helpful, and go Bruins.